By 2050, climate change is projected to displace over 1 billion people from their homes. 1 billion. That is more than the entire population of Africa forced into migration, conflict, and desperation, and the political shockwaves from that single reality are already reshaping governments, alliances, and power structures across every continent on Earth right now. In the next 10 minutes, you are going to discover exactly how climate change has quietly become the most powerful political force of the 21st century. We will walk through how it is redrawing borders, igniting wars, collapsing governments, and even creating brand new geopolitical rivalries you probably have never heard of. And we will get to the one thing that almost nobody in mainstream politics wants to admit, a truth about climate and power that turns the entire global order upside down. Stay with us, because this one changes how you see the world. To understand where we are today, you have to go back to 1992. That was the year the United Nations held the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, and world leaders signed the first major international framework for tackling climate change. It felt historic. It felt like a turning point. But here is what the headlines did not tell you: almost every major signatory continued expanding fossil fuel production within a decade of signing. The framework had no enforcement mechanism. No teeth. No consequences. And that pattern, of grand promises with hollow follow-through, has defined international climate politics ever since. The Kyoto Protocol came in 1997. The United States, the world's second-largest emitter at the time, never ratified it. The Paris Agreement arrived in 2015 with enormous fanfare, and yet global carbon emissions hit record highs just 3 years later in 2018. The political architecture built around climate has consistently lagged behind the actual pace of the crisis. And that gap between political will and physical reality is where things get genuinely dangerous. Because when institutions fail to act, the consequences do not disappear. They just become someone else's emergency. Consider what happened in Syria. Between 2006 and 2010, the country experienced its worst drought in recorded history. Crops failed. Livestock died. Nearly 1.5 million rural Syrians were forced into cities that were already overwhelmed and underfunded. Researchers at Columbia University's Earth Institute found a direct statistical link between that drought, made significantly worse by climate change, and the social pressure that helped ignite the Syrian civil war. A conflict that killed over 500,000 people and displaced 12 million more began, in part, with a weather pattern. This is not an isolated case. The Sahel region of Africa, a strip of land stretching across the continent just south of the Sahara Desert, has seen temperatures rise 1.5 times faster than the global average. Farmers and herders who once coexisted are now in direct violent competition over shrinking water and land. The conflict between farming communities and nomadic herders in Nigeria alone has killed more people annually than the Boko Haram insurgency. Climate stress is not just a background condition. It is an active engine of political violence. But here is what nobody talks about: the nations contributing least to climate change are suffering its consequences most severely. The entire African continent produces less than 4% of global carbon emissions. Yet Africa is home to 7 of the 10 countries most vulnerable to climate impacts according to the Global Climate Risk Index. This is not just a moral injustice. It is a political time bomb, because it is generating a growing and increasingly vocal bloc of nations in the global south who view climate inaction by wealthy countries not as negligence, but as a form of aggression. And that resentment is starting to reshape diplomacy in ways that would have seemed impossible 20 years ago. At the COP27 summit in Egypt in 2022, developing nations forced through a landmark agreement establishing a loss and damage fund, a mechanism requiring wealthy, high-emitting countries to financially compensate vulnerable nations for climate harms they did not cause. It was the first time in 30 years of international climate negotiations that such a fund was formally agreed upon. That is not charity. That is political pressure finally reaching a breaking point. Now let us talk about the Arctic, because this is where climate change is doing something extraordinary and almost paradoxical. As the Arctic warms at 4 times the global average rate, sea ice is melting, and an entirely new ocean is opening up. New shipping routes. New fishing grounds. And most critically, access to an estimated 30% of the world's undiscovered natural gas reserves and 13% of undiscovered oil reserves, sitting directly beneath the newly navigable Arctic seabed. This is why Russia, Canada, Denmark, Norway, and the United States are all currently engaged in overlapping territorial claims in the Arctic. Russia alone has deployed over 40 new military vessels and built 14 new operational military bases above the Arctic Circle since 2014. China, which does not even border the Arctic, officially declared itself a near-Arctic state and has invested billions in what it calls Polar Silk Road infrastructure. A region that was irrelevant to global power politics just 2 decades ago is now one of the fastest militarizing zones on the planet, and climate change unlocked it. Meanwhile, water is becoming what oil was to the 20th century. Freshwater scarcity is already a driver of political tension between India and Pakistan, Ethiopia and Egypt, and across Central Asia where Soviet-era water-sharing agreements are collapsing under drought conditions they were never designed to handle. The Nile River basin alone involves 11 countries and growing hostility over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, a hydroelectric project that Egypt has called an existential threat to its water supply. Military options have been openly discussed at the highest levels of the Egyptian government. This is not metaphor. Water politics is now hard security politics. Here is a pattern interrupt worth pausing on. According to a 2021 report from the International Food Policy Research Institute, climate change could push an additional 130 million people into extreme poverty by 2030. Extreme poverty does not stay contained. It generates migration, political instability, and the conditions in which authoritarian movements historically thrive. Every climate projection is also a political forecast, whether or not politicians choose to read it that way. Domestically, climate change is also restructuring political coalitions in ways that defy old left-right frameworks. In Australia, recurring catastrophic wildfires directly contributed to a political realignment in 2022 that swept out a long-standing conservative government resistant to climate policy. In small island states like Tuvalu and Kiribati, entire governments are now engaged in legal proceedings to have their nations recognized as states even after their territories are submerged, a constitutional crisis that international law has no existing framework to handle. And in the United States, military branches have formally classified climate change as a threat multiplier, meaning the Pentagon is now planning logistics, deployments, and base vulnerability assessments around sea level rise and extreme weather scenarios that politicians are still debating in public. The most counterintuitive insight in all of this is the following. Climate change is not slowing globalization. It is creating a new version of it, one organized around resource scarcity instead of resource abundance. The 20th century's global order was built on cheap energy, open trade, and the assumption of stable growing populations in stable geographies. All three of those foundations are now under direct physical stress. The countries, companies, and coalitions that understand this earliest will set the terms of the next global order. The ones that do not will find themselves politically isolated and economically vulnerable in ways they are not currently modeling. Green energy itself is already generating new geopolitical rivalries. Lithium, cobalt, and rare earth minerals essential for batteries and solar panels are heavily concentrated in a handful of countries, principally China, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Chile. China currently controls over 60% of global rare earth processing capacity. The race to secure these supply chains is reshaping trade policy, military alliances, and diplomatic relationships at extraordinary speed. Climate change did not create geopolitics. But it has become its most powerful accelerant.